Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm thrilled to share a bit of my process behind making something I call the Felton Annual Report. This is a project I've been doing for about 7 years now, and I'm a graphic designer by trade, and one of the things graphic designers need is content. And so with a desire to tell my own stories, I found through a process of elimination that the best story I had access to was my own story. And so what I started doing was tracking the minutiae of my life and trying to figure out how to turn this into something that would describe the patterns and nuances of my day-to-day existence. So here you can see a spread from the first printed edition. This is the 2006 Felton Annual Report. On the left, you can see my travel habits. These are the places that I went, how much time I spent in Manhattan versus Brooklyn versus some of the other lesser visited boroughs. On the right, you can see music, and some of the different data sources coming in are from Last.fm, they're from iTunes, and then from manually collected things. So as I look back on this process of collecting this data, I can identify 3 different processes that went into this. One of these is archaeology. So this is sort of the process of looking back into old data or an old corpus and extracting useful information from it. And this is something that I've done in the initial annual report. So this was in 2005. When I wasn't tracking for any purpose, I was just able to look into records that I'd naturally been keeping, and I was able to extract these different stories. So in this case, this is a story about my photography. And by looking at the set of photos I took over the year, I could attach location to them, I could attach topics, and I could provide this histogram that says which countries are more interesting, or that I took 1% of my photos had my cat in them. Skip ahead to 2010. This is an annual report that I made about my father's life after he passed away. And so again, this is an archaeology. I'm working only with the data that I have at my disposal. And so I'm going through it and trying to organize it, trying to give it metadata in ways that I can identify patterns about my father's life. This is the corpus of material that I had to draw on. So we have about 3,000 slides, 50 years of passports, postcards, 30 years of calendars. And what I did was I digitized all of it. So all of his calendars I put into spreadsheets, and then I started tagging them so that I could make associations between them and derive patterns. His passports, this was a process of identifying all the location and timestamps that go along with it to try and make this map of all the places that he went in the course of his life, and of trying to decipher these stamps. Some of them are like CAPTCHAs, some of them are in different languages. Thankfully, we have tools these days that allow us to make sense of these things. Some primary documents, like his birth certificate. And he was very helpful as well, and he left behind lists of where he'd lived and who he'd worked for. So these came in handy and actually became somewhat of the backbone of this process. I even came to embrace receipts. So while most of us see these as junk, this is something that I've come to identify as this amazing sort of time and location stamped sheet of paper. So you can go back to these and see where someone was in 1989. And then postcards were another great source of telling me where he lived over the course of his lifetime. That's a family tree. And then I went through the process of identifying all of his photos, trying to give them locations, trying to identify people who were in them, so I could tell you things like what his favorite waterfall was. This was Iguazu, based on the number of photos that he took of it. And finally, this will be recognizable to most people in the room, but for me, this was really the crux of the project, was that I found this old EKG of his in a desk drawer. And so having my father's heartbeat preserved and then being able to reproduce it in a quantification of his life was this great, really moving record of his life, and talk to the greater sense of the project as well. So here you can see his life as quantified. And this was sort of a 4 or 5 week struggle to bring all of this information to life, to make it not just a severe accounting of what he'd done, but to actually try and extract his personality from it. So on a base level, I'm trying to describe all the places he visited, but I'm also trying to pull out little pieces of the patterns that described his life, like who were his favorite lunch partners, or where were his favorite places to go. And here you can see some details. So looking at his calendars, I can identify this meta trend in the 80s where he retired, which is the white line declining in the top left corner, and other lines like travel and time with kids were on the rise. So this is strictly done from categorizing his calendars and looking at his activities. And this is another interesting thing I identified, that he had a beard for 6 months from April to September of 1970, and this is just by looking at the photos that I have of him. And then this is a piece of the atlas that I made that describes all the different places that he traveled. And I have some thoughts on archaeology. I think it's a great approach, but it's also rooted in the source material. So you're stuck with what you're working with. And with my father, I was lucky to have a really rich corpus of material. And there's typically incompleteness, but you just have to embrace that. So this is another process I've been very good at. And it's what I consider data hoarding. And this is what happens when you identify data streams and you don't want to let go of them like receipts. So the bulk of my reports have been based on data hoarding. This is 2006, where I started collecting expressly for the purposes of making this document. I explored places I ate and drank. And here you can see all the different it's a taxonomy of all the different animals I ate in 2006. I don't think it's a scientific taxonomy, but in 2007, I took this a level further. So driven by my curiosity, I tried to answer questions like how many lethal doses of caffeine did I drink over the course of the year, and which roads did I walk down in New York City. So the hoarding continued. So 6.8 lethal doses, and that's how many milligrams of caffeine I estimated I drank. In 2008, I became fascinated with how far I traveled over the course of the year. So I adopted a pedometer. I started keeping track of both real-world mileage, and in Grand Theft Auto 4, I could get helicopter mileage and motorcycle mileage, so I incorporated that. But the idea here was to come up with one number that could be a sort of totemic number for the year. And this is part of that number. 38,500, I think, in 24 was the number of miles that I had traveled over the course of the year. And I felt like this would encapsulate both the sick days when I don't travel very far and the vacation days where I travel thousands of miles. And finally, this is the 2010-2011 biennial report. This is a report in which I tried to track every single place that I went over the course of the year. And I also tried to tackle who I was with so that I could say, with my girlfriend, these are the places that we like to go. With my best friend, this is where we go. When I'm in New York, these are my habits. When I'm elsewhere, these are my other habits. And you can see these all sort of overlaid in this document where blue represent 2010 and the magenta represents 2011. And then they're overlaid in different manners with pie charts evaluating the different behaviors, and here's a detail. So this is with my girlfriend. You can see in the left, that's California, and on the right-hand side, that's New York City. So there's a yarn connecting all these places, and you can see from the purple ones where the overlap occurs, which were the places that we went to over both years. So this is one of the downsides of hoarding. This is what your calendar comes to look like when you're trying to track everything you eat and drink, everywhere you go, and everyone you're with. So it's kind of color-coded. And I did this for 2 years, and then I let it go. So these are my thoughts on hoarding. You can achieve a high degree of completeness with this, but the costs are high. And in trying to create these documents, I'm trying to come up with methodologies that don't interfere in the life I'm trying to record. So I constantly get the question like, do you ever track how much time you spend tracking? Which for me is a sort of recursive problem, and I don't want to think about it. But I don't even do any analysis until the end of the year. I want to tally this all up and then look back on the behavior. And there are certain problems that I just can't get at. These are sort of the intractable set, and these have driven some of the other experiments that I've done. So I feel like tracking food is a very complicated problem that no one has really cracked. Reading is something that should be quite easy, but we do it on many devices. We do it with paper. We do it with e-ink devices, and that's not unlocked. Mood is something I feel like I'm very bad at self-reporting. TV, I find, is kind of interesting. Even if you knew when the box was on, you don't even know if you're paying attention to it. And conversation is another thing that really fascinates me, whether I could track all the conversations I have. So these are things I consider imprecise or too tough to capture, but I'm always trying to push my approach to be able to embrace these things. And this brings me to the third approach that I've started tinkering with, which is sampling. So trying to just use these discrete measurements to make sense of behaviors I find really complicated. This was the basis of my 2009 annual report. I really wanted to figure out what my mood was. I had a couple questions. How happy was I? And am I an introvert or an extrovert? So if I felt like I'd had a meaningful encounter with you, this is the sort of legalese that I set up around it. If we had a meaningful encounter, then you would receive one of these cards from me. And it invited you to visit a URL where you would answer a survey. And I made these very rigid and letterpress so that you wouldn't throw it away. This would haunt you, and when you had time, you would go to this survey and answer all these different questions. So about our activities and my mood and what we talked about. And this is what the report wound up looking like. It incorporates some of the quotes from it, but I had to quantify all this information that was all just unstructured data that came in. So here's a list of all the different moods I was described as having. You will see that there's probably not an index that would include chopsticks or Californian. So I asked Mechanical Turk to rate all these words on these axes, from happy to sad or introverted to extroverted. And I was able to come up with an indices for this. So I can tell you now that chopsticks is slightly positive. It's a 0.8 on this scale. Californian is also actually more neutral. It's closer to 0. It's 0.4. But things like buzzy, just these really esoteric terms, I was able to make sense of. And I could tell you that my average mood for that year was swell, which is in my index is 73.9% happy. And I also found out that I'm an ambivert, which is somewhere in between introverted and extroverted. And so finally, I talk about embracing sampling. So for this year, I've had this app developed, which is called Reporter. It was built for me. And what Reporter does is it buzzes approximately every 90 minutes. It's not on a schedule, so I can't game the system. And it asks me what I'm doing and also takes all these background readings. So you can see the row of sensors above the top. It's getting location. It's getting time. It's getting the weather from an API. It gets the ambient audio and then some stuff that's running on the phone, like connectivity and what apps are in the stack and how many photos I've taken since the last time it goes off. And then I take a survey. So now I'm giving context to all these ambient readings. So I'm telling it where I am and what I'm doing. I tell it what I'm wearing. And this solves a couple of questions for me. So I also have the eating and drinking in there. But in terms of tackling a couple of intractable questions, one of them is what tools are you using, which to try and do this with perfect accuracy would be basically impossible. But if you're just asked in this sampled method, you can start to make sense of it. And also social networks. So whereas before, when I tried to track who I was with, I just had a selected set of people. And I knew that when I was with my girlfriend, I was going to track when she was around and when she wasn't around. Versus this, I can now keep track of the guy who sits behind me at work, who I don't socialize with, but maybe I spend more time with him than my girlfriend. So I'm really interested in how these results will net out and figuring out which networks are connected to which and how. And so here are my thoughts on sampling, that there is value in this incompleteness, and I can gain insight here. And I also hope that having about 4,000 records at the end of the year will be enough for some interesting results. Thank you very much.